children in Nebraska. And for those of you not familiar with this, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan child research and advocacy organization, and our mission is to build opportunities for all children in our community with research, advocacy, and community engagement. If you have heard of Voices for Children, you may have heard of our annual Kids Count Nebraska report. It's the, can you hear me? It's the largest, most comprehensive research on child well-being in Nebraska, and it tracks how Nebraska kids are doing from a data perspective on over 200 indicators related to health, education, safety, and economic well-being. And when we say safety, we're generally talking about child welfare and juvenile justice systems. And those are just some stats from our last year's report, our 2013 report, and our 2014 report will be coming out in January, so these will be updated. And really that data that we collect in our Kids Count report is really the basis of everything we do. We can't know where we need to go unless we understand where we are, right? So from using that data, we're really able to look at how are Nebraska kids doing? Who are the Nebraska kids who aren't doing as well as others? Where do other states do a lot better on child well-being, and what are those states doing that we aren't? So we're able to ask those questions sort of based on that data. When we talk about poverty, I think it's always important to kind of define what people are generally talking about. And this is the federal poverty line in 2014. And you can see for one person, it would be just under $12,000 a year. And for a family of four, so 2 adults and 2 kids, it would be just under $24,000. The official poverty line was developed in the 1960s and is based just on the cost of food. And at that time, food constituted about a third of the family's budget. So we took that number, we multiplied it by 3, and we update it every year. So what the poverty line is useful for is tracking changes over time, and it's our benchmark for eligibility for all of our public programs. What it doesn't tell us is anything about what families actually need to make ends meet, and how families in our community are really faring economically. That being said, these are our official poverty rates in Nebraska for kids. And you can see we've had a pretty significant jump in poverty since the year 2000. We were down at about 10% of kids in poverty in 2000. This is the entire state. And now we're at about 17.7% of kids. And the other really significant thing I think you'll see here is that we have ongoing significant disparities in our poverty rates based on race and ethnicity. And those trends have continued to be exacerbated over time. This past year, we actually saw poverty tick down just a little bit, but it ticked down for white kids and it ticked up for children of color. And those are the type of trends that we look at and see as being really troubling. These are our Omaha poverty rates, and you'll notice that our overall child poverty rate in Omaha is a little bit higher than the rest of the state at 19.1%. And again, you'll continue to see the disparities in our poverty rates here. When we talk about the racial disparities in poverty rates, I always like to give that a little bit of context, and I think Carol's opening set that up well when we talk about our systems and structures and how they can perpetuate inequities, including poverty. But sometimes when someone says that sentence, it's really hard to understand what that means, and so I always like to give an example. And there's a great video I'm just going to show you 2 seconds of that I think explains it a lot more clearly behind it. Hopefully this works.
GIs came home ready to start families, but hadn't a place to live.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans getting to purchase a home.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman: we're interested in your home, we're interested in buying one, and what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even one or two non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized the national appraisal system, where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those
So if you have time to watch that whole video, it's a PBS series called Race, the House We Live In, and it's a really great series, but I think it really explains how for a long time in this country we had federal policies that dictated access to the housing market based on race, and a lot of those things had generational consequences, right? So did the parents have a home that they could borrow against to send their kids to college? Did they then have an asset to pass on to that next generation? And some of our policies from, that were in place until about the 1960s really are still having a strong impact on the disparities we see in poverty rates today. And, even the relationship between education financing and property values, when we look at the racialized history of housing policy in this country, continues to create additional challenges in that sphere. This slide is not going to be a huge surprise, but poverty is really bad for kids. So it's associated with a variety of negative outcomes: lack of adequate nutrition, lack of access to affordable health care, lack of quality early educational experiences, and a variety of challenges that higher income peers generally don't have. I think the other thing that's important about those risk factors is that they often have consequences that last into adulthood. Kids who come into contact with the juvenile justice system are more likely to become involved with the adult criminal justice system. Kids who lack access to early health care, early nutrition, some of those things have health consequences that carry over into adulthood. And certainly the educational experiences, there's sort of a cumulative effect of them over a lifetime that can lead to lower graduation rates and ultimately less likelihood of accessing higher education. I think the other interesting thing in Nebraska is that our poverty rates persist in spite of our strong employment statistics. So we often hear that the solution to poverty is employment. And I think that employment is certainly a piece, but we have to define what we're talking about. We need to be accessing high quality employment, and that means employment that includes benefits and employment that really pays a living wage. In Nebraska, we have a higher percentage, I think we're 8th in the nation of the number of workers holding multiple jobs. We have 8.6 Nebraska workers are holding multiple jobs, and nationally it's only 4.9%. And only 2% of Nebraska kids are living in a home where there's no working adults. So the working adult may or may not be a parent, but it could be a grandparent or another adult, but we still have almost 20% of our kids living in poverty, and only 2% of those kids are not living with a working adult. In part because of the challenges I mentioned with the poverty line, and there's a tool on our website, we tried to look at a different definition of economic security. We call it the family bottom line. And it accounts for regional variations in the cost of living, and it also looks at variances in cost based on the age of the children, and it really tries to determine what does a Nebraska family living in a certain county with a certain number of children of varying ages need to make ends meet without assistance. And this is the family bottom line for, this is an aggregate of our metropolitan regions, but it's pretty close to what Douglas County would be, and it shows the minimum cost of what a family, in this case a single parent family and a 2-parent family with 2 kids would really need to get by. And when we looked back at the poverty line for family of 4, it was just under $24,000. For that same family, under this measure of economic security, it would be almost $50,000 a year. When you take into account housing, child care, transportation, and the net effect of taxes. And I should mention there's a tool on our website if you want to look at it where you can actually input a county and family type and look at that more closely. I'm going to try and speed up because my time is running out, but the other interesting thing is we look at where families are spending their money, and for families with young kids, child care is the largest cost in the family budget, followed by housing and then food. And remember that our poverty line is actually based on the cost of food, which is not the most significant expense for families today. I always like to show this slide when we're talking about poverty because I think poverty often feels like a giant unsolvable problem. It feels that way to me some days too, but this slide always helps me put things in perspective because when you look at what's happened with our poverty rates in this country among the elderly compared to what's happened in kids, if we look back to the 1960s, the elderly poverty rate was almost at around 30 to 35%. And kids were just below that at around 25 to 30%. And then when you look at our poverty rates today, the elderly poverty rate is actually the lowest line over here. It's at 9.1%, and kids nationally are at 21.8%. And does anybody have any thoughts on what are some of the things that have helped mitigate that poverty rate among the elderly?
Social Security and Medicare.
Exactly, Social Security and Medicare. So, we made a decision to make some of those collective investments, and they really made a difference. And we could do the same for our kids. So I'm going to talk very quickly about some of the policy solutions. I think one of the things I mentioned was quality early childhood systems and programs. So looking at our child care systems, in Nebraska, almost 75% of our kids have all available parents in the workforce, that's kids under 6. So we know our kids are being cared for by someone else. So where are they being cared for, and what is the quality of the settings they're in? So addressing eligibility for child care assistance to make it affordable for families, and also ensuring that child care assistance is providing quality programming. I'm going to skip this because I know James is going to talk about it. And then tax credits for working families. the Earned Income Tax Credit is widely considered one of the most effective anti-poverty programs we have in this country. And in 2012, it lifted about 6.5 million people, including 3.3 million children above the poverty line. So it's a tax credit that we could increase that really helps working families. And then the final thing I'm going to mention just quickly is access to higher education. So right now when we do interventions aimed at making higher education affordable and accessible, we really are looking at the farther end of the spectrum, right? So when a kid gets close to college, we say, you know, where are you going to college? And maybe we have a scholarship or some financial assistance to offer. But what we're really finding is that the impact of the educational experience that a child has are really cumulative. And really, if we don't find ways to get college-based interventions to young kids, you're really making it much more challenging to have those interventions later on. And one of the really innovative things that a lot of states and cities are doing is child savings accounts for education. So if you're a lucky kid born in San Francisco, you get a $50 educational savings account when you enter kindergarten. And then there's incentives where private foundations add to that for things like perfect attendance. In Nevada, every kid in the state is getting one of those, as well as in Maine. So that's one of the interesting educational interventions. And then I'm just going to wrap up quickly with how to get involved. Connect with the organizations who are reading all those bills and those policies and sending out information about it, like ours. Use your voice with policymakers, write op-eds, letters to the editor, come to public events, rallies, and press conferences to show your support. And with that, I'm